All right, I think it's all good to go. Best of luck to both teams. Over to you, Michael.
Perfect. Welcome everyone to the Open Grand Final of Campbelltown Australs 2022. In this debate, we have UP Diliman 1 on the affirmative team and USU 3 on the negative team. First off, a massive congratulations to both teams for making it to this stage of the tournament. It's obviously a huge achievement and the whole panel is really excited to see the debate. Tonight's debate will be on the topic, assuming the technology exists, that it is immoral to create simulated high-fidelity alternate universes. We will now proceed with the debate, and I'd like to call upon the first affirmative speaker.
Hello. So I just want to double check if I'm visible and audible. All right. Thank you. Just give me a second to prepare. Hello. So before I start my speech, there are just a couple of people that I want to shout out in the live stream, something that I don't usually do before finals. So just want to shout out my family, the partners that I've had in past college majors. So that would be Marco Dava, Miguel Sulit, Gab Pacanio, the lower batch of debaters and EPDS that have showered me with love and support. So Jade, David, Neil, other peers in my batch of EPDS such as Isa, Macha, Gab, Jaime, past coaches such as RJ Lim, Jasmine, high school debate partners such as Jake, Miko Cano, the kids that I coach in high school, and most importantly, the debate partners that are currently with me here in this grand final, Bea and Luigi. I hope to make you all proud. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The problem with this technology is that it is Pandora's box. The moment you create a universe, you are creating suffering. You're creating an infinite amount of different possibilities that oftentimes leads to the instrumentalization of the lives of individuals that even makes the people in our own current universe incredibly problematic. A couple of bits of setup. So what exactly would we imagine this technology to look like? So this is going to be a highly advanced, visceral, real technology that would recreate the conditions of humanity and of the world in different separate universes. So it would mimic the human experiences of people and their emotions. It would mimic the environments, things such as war, poverty, scarcity, the natural resources that are present in a lot of cases. We would assume this would be similar to other simulations you would see in TV shows such as Inception, where you'd be able to transport to some other alternate universe. Second of all, take note that even though you're making the simulation, we will concede that you will have some extent of control to be able to touch and play around with these in the universe, right? Like being able to move or switch around. But take note that there is some inevitability that you cannot control every single outcome that goes on within that universe, because there is simply factors that are outside of your control if you're going to make it very similar towards that existing current universe, right? So you can't control the emotions of those people if you're trying to program free will. You can't program like a mountain not to experience some form of like glacial patterns or something, given that they're making it very close to reality. With this, I'm going to forward 2 arguments. The first one is to suggest why you create infinite moral suffering that leads to harm to the vast majority of people that are going to enter into a lot of these universes. And second of all, explaining why people that are not a part of the alternate universe, the people in the status quo, why they're going to suffer. First of all, why create infinite suffering. 3 parts. First, on the utilitarian angle. So I just want to make it clear that the framing for this argument is that we think that morality was oftentimes defined by utilitarianism, right? Because oftentimes there are many things within our current universe that are very uncertain, but the thing that is certain is the fact that there are effects that happen on the specific people, whether or not there are benefits or harms, right? We think that therefore the metric by which you're able to assume what is a moral good is whether or not it provides pain or pleasure to specific individuals, right? What is the problem when you're creating the technology for this to happen? Because we argue that there is no distinction between simulation and reality. The problem under their side is that you're going to create different intelligent life forms, such as humans and animals, that will have the exact same capacity, given that the motion states that it is close to reality, right? They will have the ability to emote, to have lived experiences, to have things like friends and family. But the difference is, take note that even if it's just a simulation, just because it's code doesn't mean that they feel anything in the first place. Oftentimes, the way how we ascribe moral worth in the status quo is whether or not they're able to function these things in the first place, right? What do we think is the problem? We think that the problem is that the simulation, in the process of trying to mimic the different conditions in the world, will lead to a lot of the reasons why people are suffering today. Things such as scarcity and poverty, the social inequality and discrimination the different minority groups such as African Americans or women face in the status quo, the specific wars and conflicts that make millions of people die as a result, right? Take note that we can see that there could be some possible form of good, right? Like people could have happy lives, but we think that this is uncertain versus the certainty that they will face a lot of these negative conditions that exist in the first place, right? What we would argue is that a lot of the negative conditions like scarcity and the things that I mentioned previously outweigh a lot of those good things, given that resources are finite, given that a lot of times it takes a very long time for you to fix a lot of the social institutions. Take note that even in the status quo, even if we're able to have multiple different supranational organizations trying to aim for its peace and stability, a lot of these problems still exist. We would rather err on the side of caution and try to protect those individuals, given that we think that they're not likely to get those protections in the first place. But the second reason this is just why it's also hard for them is because we think that there are going to be perverse incentives for particular actors to use this in malevolent ways. So maybe they could do things like killing off people from another alternate universe, right? Or maybe they could support crime in those specific places. Take note, this could be a very speculative claim, we agree, but the mere fact that it could happen leads to an infinite amount of suffering, because one person that could commit crime in another universe can create a harm for 8 billion people in Earth 2 or in Earth 3 or in Earth 4, which means that it's going to be far harder for you to catch these things in the first place. The second reason to suggest, even if you don't buy the consequentialist framework for suffering, is that we think that it is immoral to use people as a means to an end. Because even if there's some form of net good that you receive as the person using that technology, we think that there are two problems when you're using the simulation. First of all, oftentimes a lot of these entities and a lot of these moral beings do not consent to being born. They cannot weigh in whether or not they want to live within that universe. So you're forcing their existence without their ability to meaningfully decide whether or not they want to be a part of that universe. But second of all, we think that you're also using people as a means to an end. You're probably going to use them for your own personal gain. We think that morality dictates that it is immoral to do these things, given that these are individuals that have their own agency, that have lives that they want to live. The last thing that I want to engage with is that let's take the burden or the case of opposition at their best, where they say that there are going to be incentives for you to want to use this benevolently. You want to do this simulation to help promote social causes, like understand how climate change would work so that you can help climate change in your own current universe. 3 reasons why that isn't going to be the case. First of all, we think that you're not going to be able to do that, right? Because if it is true that these people are autonomous and these are people who are able to control, are very close to reality, that means that you cannot tell people in that universe what to do, right? So you can't like make everyone solve the collective action problem by making all 7 billion people say, you know what, let's start solve climate change, right? You cannot control the specific ways how people are going to react in these spaces. But second of all, even if it is true, we think that there are going to be an infinite amount of universes that you're going to expand to solve the problem of climate change, right? Because it's not going to take one universe, it's going to take 10, 100, 1,000. These are very problematic issues if their side is going to suggest that, right? Which leads to the suffering for those set of individuals. But lastly, we just argue that there are already an existing set of mechanisms that allow you to solve those problems in the status quo, things such as researchers and scientists and their ability to do things like create geoengineering and all of these different things. The weighing for this argument is specifically important because we think that even if this could be harmful because you don't help current generations, it harms an infinite amount of people under their side, where they're going to be people that are going to inevitably suffer. Moving on to the second argument, engaging with why it's also going to be bad for the people within the current universe. 2 reasons. 1, because we're going to have a lot of people have a massive sense of social comparison, a deep sense of anxiety, knowing that there are other universes out there that are better than them, right? But you think the problem is that, let's say their side want to say that you can transport to other universes and go to, I don't know, some other new land. We think that the problem is that there are structural reasons for that to be unequal because of class structures that make sure that it's going to be trapped to the rich, right? Or for instance, reasons for it to be incredibly expensive because it's going to be highly technical and specialized knowledge, which means that you're going to lock out the vast majority of the middle class in a lot of these cases. So you will know that existence is better in another universe, or it's better in that Earth version of Earth 2, but you will never be able to be there and you will only dream of it, right? Knowing that sense of social comparison is going to be incredibly crippling, feeling as if you have no ability to actually change your life. You think that's bad. But second of all, even if you are able to move to these places, the problem is that you forego a lot of your existing moral obligations that you have to other people. Because let's say you could transport to that other alternate universe, you'll be leaving your friends, your family, all of these people that you had a priori moral obligations to because you cared for them in that existing universe before you created that new alternate universe, before you started using the technology. We think that that is specifically harmful because you damage a lot of the relationships that people have once you know that you're trying to attempt to start a family in another place, want to make life better for yourself in that other place, right? Because people are going to perceive you as selfish. You're going to create a lot of internal turmoil within a lot of your new relationships that they're going to create. We think the reason why this argument is important is because we think that it creates massive amounts of personal chaos on the ends of yourself, given that you're going to probably be incredibly unhappy as a result of the creation of this technology. For those reasons, affirm.
I'd like to thank the first affirmative speaker for that speech and call upon the first negative speaker.
Just checking I can be heard.
Yep.
Great. Starting in 5 seconds. The world as it exists may be full of suffering, but this affirmative case relies on this universe being net negative utility. It relies on all the lives that are being lived not being worth it. And we think that is a very unreasonable proposition. A child also doesn't consent to be born. Affirmative must also argue that having children is immoral. It's almost entirely analogous in this situation. Firstly, setup. First part of setup, what is the burden on side affirmative? We say that the burden on side affirmative is that it is immoral to ever create a universe such as this. It's not to say that, the average universe is created might be immoral. For instance, in the debate that the death penalty is immoral, the negative team is not bound to support the current US system of the death penalty. The debate is about the principled legitimacy of the act itself. That means if negative can prove there are some instances where it would be good, then it is not immoral. Secondly, let's talk about how it's likely used, how we think we would envisage it in a way that negative team supports. The first thing to note is you're likely to simulate your universe as it is. That means you can skip the medieval era, all that suffering. You can just start off as a representation of right now. Secondly, we think it would be likely to be random simulations. That means we give the people in that universe agency. We see what they would do next. Due to things like chaos theory, due to things like differences and all the differences that affirmative outlines, the universe will be incrementally different to ours. We will see how that universe evolves differently. We learn from what they do. We can also speed it up, given we control the code, and see what happens in those instances. We can learn from them. We can take the successful examples. But importantly, all we are doing to this universe is observing. And again, it's analogous to bringing a child into the world, seeing how that child interacts in the world, but unlike a parent, not actively taking steps to control that child's life. Final thing, next thing to note, let's be clear. It is unlikely that you can travel into this alternate universe. That is because it is a simulated, artificial intelligence universe. There's nothing, like that at the moment. But even if it is, I think the impacts are marginal. I don't think there are impacts in terms of, whether people feel jealous or not that are going to be more significant than anything else in this debate. Happy to have that debate if we want. We just don't think it's the main part of it. Final question, I think the most important question in setup, because this really decides the direction of this debate, is whether the people in this universe are sentient. And the answer is that we don't know, and we can't know, right? The best AI ethicists in the world don't know whether AI can be sentient. Google's Lambda project, it is unclear whether there is sentience or not. So even if you have a perfectly accurate universe, there is a reasonable chance that that is still something that is not sentient life. We're going to engage in the rest of the debate on both comparatives. So firstly, if the life in this universe is not sentient, we say that this is an automatic win for side negative. That is because even if we're only able to achieve marginally better life for people living on Earth in the status quo, that is a clear benefit, very little harm that you can prove on side affirmative. Importantly, they give us the reasons that this would be true. You can repeat it multiple times. You can gather a huge amount of information. You can simulate to the point where you have almost perfect predictive power over what might happen in the status quo if you implement particular policies. And that's particularly important because uncertainty is one of the things that removes our capacity to accurately do the things that need to be done. Risk is a huge reason why policies that need to be implemented don't get implemented. What does this look like practically? It looks like adjusting minor economic policy, but it also does just look like the things that Affirmative says about adjusting climate policy. And yes, maybe we have some information in the status quo, but of course that's not enough. At the moment, we are facing almost certain death in the face of many things that will affect our lives. But we can also, imagine a little bit further, where might this universe send their space probes? We might know where aliens are on their, on our side of the house. Or we can see that this universe might concentrate its resources on curing a particular disease. We can gather that information and find the cure to that disease on Earth much, much faster. The impact of that is huge because millions of people's lives certainly get better in the status quo, in the world that we know exists. And that's important because the only thing we certainly know in this debate is that our lives are real, that the lives of the people around us are lives with moral value, and it would be the most moral thing to improve them in the best way possible. Other questions in the debate are uncertain. We don't know whether this is something that is morally valuable or not. But to the extent you can improve the lives of the people that do exist, it is worth doing. But let's engage with the other comparative. Accept the Affirmative team's characterization that these lives are sentient. We just say that is even better for side negative because, of course, on net, human life has positive value. I think empirically, most of us would agree that we would rather live our lives than not live our lives, but there are a number of structural reasons why that is likely to be true. The first is to say humans have biological mechanisms, hedonic treadmills, which means that most people tend to gravitate to a certain level of happiness, regardless of how bad their experiences are. And for most people, that tends to be relatively happy. And people tend to self-select into the things that make them happy. They choose to hang out with people that they like. They have family members that they love. Those small things add up to something that is far greater in terms of its utility value than any harm that you might get from the worst wars or famines on Earth. But secondly, empirically, most people would rather choose to be alive than dead. If you put this question to every single person on Earth, most people would choose that they would rather be alive. I think the people in this universe would follow suit. But thirdly, all the actors in this universe also have agency, right? They have the ability to stop being alive if they wanted to. They can opt out. It's analogous to bringing a child into the world. We think it is not immoral at face value to do that. But secondly, we would note if the code does tell us that utility is going to go net negative, then we can alter it or reset it if necessary. We can stop people from, going into that suffering if the universe is so absolutely horrible that we see that people are suffering. But finally, as we improve our universe, the replicas, the iterations of our universe also get better too. So the previous point influences this point as well. But fourthly, even if there is net suffering, I think it is more immoral to deny all people in this new universe a chance at life. That is, there might be an objectively utilitarian answer that suffering is something that will exist, but people find other metrics to judge their own moral value on. It is unclear whether utilitarianism was the best answer for every individual person. Some of them might prefer just the agency and the ability to being alive. We should default to their wishes. That is something that is not intrinsically immoral, even at our very least. Finally, we think it is not immoral for the reason that the creation of this universe may allow us to find meaning of our own existence, of our own universe. And the argument here is simple. If this technology exists in this universe, then it is incredibly statistically likely that we are also in a simulation, right? If we have the technology to create a simulation, if that technology exists, it is just based on the pure chance that this is a random, God or, abstract created universe, compared to the chance that this is another simulation that someone else has created, is just very, very small. Which means I don't think it is immoral if we are at least giving ourselves a chance to understand why we might be created, what the sorts of mechanisms through which we would be created are, sort of understand our own existence. And that is a fundamental question that maybe the questions that Affirmative team pose can't really answer. This policy, this technology was never immoral just on itself. It might be used badly, but we explain why the act itself is something that is by far worth doing.
I'd like to thank the first negative speaker for that speech and call upon the second affirmative speaker.
Okay, all right. Hello, everyone. My name is Luigi Alcaneses. He, him, they. I'll be the second for this speech. As I did with the previous out rounds, I will ask people to forgive me again, as I will take advantage of this opportunity since this exact moment may never be replicated again. Thank you always to my parents, my family in Ateneo, whom I will always be deeply grateful for and praying for all my days. And most importantly, if they are watching, to Miko and David, whom I wish I could be with every day. And for everyone, for those who are lost, confused, and hurt, debate may break you apart, and sometimes it's better to just leave. But I hope you find some people in this community that are worth caring about. And for that, I still decide to come back every now and then because I still believe there's some hope in the good and kind people this community has left. And yeah, maybe I might be wrong, but that doesn't mean we can't try and move forward together. All right, let's start the speech. One last. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1, and go. When we live this life, we always dream for a dream to come true. And when we live this life, we want some things we cannot see and some things we cannot reach, or something that could not exist. Negative claims that this is an unhappy world, but what they mistake is that the acknowledgement of real things is deeply debilitating as well. This is the lucidity after waking up from a dream knowing that we cannot stay asleep. This is the addiction to nostalgia because we cannot live to face our own failures. But that's not just it. What is really deeply terrifying is living the life of a zombie, the static incapacity created when life is reduced to simulations. They say that we can have good universes, but that's exactly the point. The fact that you will dream of more universes, the fact that you have to do this over and over again, create more simulations, create millions of more people to be instrumentalized for your own benefit, is one that is immoral. I'm going to argue one thing in today's speech, why it is immoral to know the future and why it exacerbates existing power imbalances. But before this, I want to respond in a few ways. Number one, what standard of morality must we use? I have 2 responses. The first thing is, at First Affirmative, we made a clear establishing claim that the creation of high-fidelity universes is immoral for the millions of sentient beings that are necessary to be created to support the functioning of these universes. Our claim was that this multiplies of suffering on a utilitarian level because life involves inevitable A, millions of individuals living in poverty to support capitalist structures due to inequality pushed by extractive industries or power imbalances like colonialism. 2, social comparisons across all levels of class where other sentient beings with the same aspirations also experience the same visceral personalities and feelings that you do as well, but it also instrumentalized particular individuals in ways that violate their consent. What was their response? Their response was to say, well, we could also be in a simulation. Even the acknowledgement that you are doing this is also a significant personal harm on your conscience because you know it's so real. And negative response is insufficient to these standards because they say, yes, this concedes that the world is already unfree today. If the world is unfree today, I want to just respond in, again, more ways to this. 1, this fails to acknowledge the freedom of other individuals that we agree to be sentient and feeling and therefore be moral beings. The fact that they agree we don't know whether they are moral being concedes that the precautionary principle must override in this instance. And the fact that they agree we could be in a simulation means that other individuals are also meaningful, sentient, and moral beings worthy of moral consideration as well. And thus, in number, sheer number, we believe that this aligns with our priorities and principles. Number 2, but it also acknowledges that this freedom is actually its own prison, that it is its own hedonic treadmill with the creation of more universe that causes deep personal unhappiness because you have to continue to spend more time in the simulation to reach higher highs for happiness. You have to neglect existing competing obligations with your family, like what we argued from Garcia. Negative response to this is to say again that, hey, at least there are some instances of good universes we create. But again, this response fails because it fails to acknowledge the hedonic treadmill among different creating universes that exacerbates the social comparison that inherently creates more suffering for some people over others due to each individual's personal happiness and aspiration to make a universe that is happy for them. When one person prioritizes their own personal happiness at the expense of more others, you create multiple universes that is also harmful for them. But B, it fails to acknowledge that observing this universe alone already creates unhappiness due to its visceral possibility and because it feels more real. On the comparative, I would argue in the worst case where you are constrained to one life, I agree that a lot of this still exists. You still have social comparisons, and I agree you can still live a relatively unhappy and static and contentment life. But the leeway and personal agency you can exercise to determine personal meaning and worth from various aspects in life, it becomes more possible. The capacity and agency to see these other meanings in life, like through religion, through your family, or through other different institutions, are much more within your control, or you will at least inevitably concede that it is more in your control when you feel that there is no universe out there, because other simulations inherently distract you to the best forms of happiness you may conceive. So I believe this is the worst video game that would exist, and thus it is one that makes it harder for individuals to at least get out of that game. Number 2, so on probability, we believe it makes more individuals unhappy, but on probability on scale for universes, it makes more simulations unhappy. Number 2, a lot of these imaginations and other universes that negative talks about. So they said, well, we can solve cancer, we can save the world. Again, probability. Number one, this is unlikely. The high fidelity aspect of this universe would most likely not go to the extent of observing an extremely or diversely alternative history, like where we're able to grow wings, or maybe we're able to, where colonialism never happened, or where penicillin was discovered 50 years earlier. These are significantly things not within your control. The realms of science are still going to likely exist in significant ways in which you are not likely going to make an innovation that would substantially change the way we live our world today. But even if that was not the case, it doesn't mean that you're able to adapt that technology immediately into our world today. It will still take a very long time. So thus, on the low likelihood that's happening, this argument should not be considered. But number two, weigh this in probability. If it is possible, how many universes would need to be created to be able to solve cancer in one universe? That multiplies the harm for more people. But look how insane this means to experiment on the people that died during the plague so that we can have more vaccines for people in life today. It is equally possible you could also cause more pandemics in their world or more nuclear war in their world in the process of trying to help our world today. And again, if we don't know what consent is, if we don't know what morality is or sentience is or what it means to be a human or all of these things, then I think we defer to the side of caution and defer to the side in which individuals are able to exact meaning in the agency that they have in the approximate life that we currently live in, which is one wherein there is no capacity to be able to go and explore any other possible reality or live in a dream. This leads me to my argument, why it is immoral to know the future, which exacerbates existing power imbalances. So this argument will tackle the best case of neg, where these individuals will be able to find out how to improve the best outcomes and improve their own quality of life by simulating other alternative universes. I would argue that this creates a more unequal world, and that is immoral. So premise, creating a technology that allows an individual to simulate real life in another universe allows certain individuals more power over others by the ability to know how their actions will impact others in this universe, what I need to get rich, what I need to do for my business to win, etc. Note that if everyone is doing this, then there is still inequality on who will win out, because those are the most powerful and most capable of changing the world, because their actions have more impact due to existing power imbalances, because people who are rich and powerful and simply have more agency to change their lives in these ways. Because again, simply in life, one person wins the lottery. The reason that is why we argue that uncertainty and risk inherent to life creates more freedom, this is our comparative, is better, is due to the following forces. Number one, states and rich individuals are more likely to be egalitarian in the vast majority of cases when they know there is only one life that they can influence, and it is better to be able to increase the probability of helping more people so that they can improve their reputation, etc. But number two, they need to be more preserving of existing natural resources in states that we currently have. Like there's an incentive to do this because of self-preserving incentive, because if we don't have the earth, we can't go to the moon, etc., etc. And thus, it is much more likely that they care more about resources like their family and the approximate things that at least would help and trickle down to help more poor individuals in the worst case. But even if that wasn't the worst case, we would argue that poor individuals are able to find more meaning in this existence that they currently have in one that is not directly manipulated or monopolized by the aspirations of richer individuals in their world. So in one wherein people have more capacity to be able to change their own life, or at least change the way that they see their own life and their own perspective, it is one they're not locked in by the only perspective of what a good life is by other richer individuals that are more in power and those that are able to exact that inequality more into them. So the gist of this argument is inequality hits you like a train in the face, and thus it becomes harder for you to justify any other way in which you can determine happiness for yourself in this world. So negative may argue some people can be happy, some people can live in this dream, but it doesn't mean that people are able to feel this happiness concretely in the world wherein they would actually want to fulfill other obligations which they otherwise would have had. Now, preferences could be arbitrary in this extent, but I would argue the process of determining these preferences is one that is within more people's control in a world where a simulation does not exist at all. And that is exactly why it is immoral on that standard. So for these reasons, so we're done with the dream then.
I'd like to thank the second affirmative speaker for that speech and call upon the second negative speaker.
Give me a second to set up all my stuff. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. My grandmother is a lady named Margaret Ryan, or to me, Grandma Margie. She's had a hard life. She grew up in rural Australia. She lost her husband and raised 4 boys and 1 girl on a war widow's pension. She lost part of her arm to skin cancer, and the other month, she almost lost her entire eye. Her smile, however, is one of the most beautiful that I know. This side affirmative would regret the life of Grandma Margie. I, for one, do not. I believe that life is beautiful, and I don't regret the creation of this universe. I certainly would not regret the creation of many more. First issue in this debate then is, do we create infinite suffering on side negative, or do we in fact create many beautiful lives of real lived experiences with autonomy and individual identities that is in fact extremely valuable and a net moral positive on the world? Second issue then, what would be the impact on the status quo? Addressing the first issue then, the first question that I must address is whether this life is in and of itself sentient, and therefore does that suffering matter in the first place? And this is contingent for any of their harms in this debate to accrue. The first claim that they make, and the only claim they make to explain this, is just that these individuals must have free will and must be somewhat similar in their behavior to ours, therefore their pain must be real. I don't think that's satisfactory to prove that these lives are sentient and that their pain does matter. At the end of the day, let's not forget, I know a lot of this characterization has referred to simulated life as people, but what we're really creating here is numbers on a computer screen. These aren't, in fact, probably real lives. They don't probably experience real meaningful pain, or at least not in the same way that we do. They might experience or look like they're experiencing real pain, but it is just a simulation. I don't think it's certain in this debate that this is, in fact, real meaningful life. What does this mean in this debate? It doesn't mean, I'm not suggesting that it's guaranteed that these lives don't matter or that they aren't sentient. I'm just saying that it's questionable. And that means you should raise a high level of questionability over the entirety of the harms brought up by their team, because there's every chance that these lives aren't sentient and therefore that they have absolutely no claim in this debate. And given that, you should weigh the certainty of all of our benefits, things like, for example, improving the lives of people on this earth much more highly than anything that they bring out. However, because there are still questions around this, all of our material about why we wouldn't use this in particularly cool ways still stands, because people wouldn't take the chance of engaging in that particularly immoral behavior. Second question of this debate then, does the existence of suffering mean that all life has a net negative value? First issue with this is, I think we can prove structurally that there has been more joy or will be more joy than sadness in the universe. Firstly, that's because empirically, most people in human history have chosen to have kids. That means that at the end of their lives and their lived experience, they believe that it was worth sending another life into this universe. That gives you a statistical measure of what every single human being on Earth has experienced and whether they thought that their life was a net positive or net negative. And every single person who's chosen to have a child, chosen to bring another human being into this world, has proven to you that they themselves believe that life is worth living and that life is a net positive, which suggests that you should give this debate to us immediately, just on the basis that we're creating meaningful and valuable human life. Second reason structurally, though, why it's likely there will be more joy than sadness is just that we know that people have good, effective coping mechanisms to deal with the worst kinds of sadnesses and enrich the best kinds of positives. That looks like, for example, the creation of religion, which means that although people do experience suffering, they find ways either to find meaning in that suffering and in fact ensure that that suffering enriches their lives and improves it, or at least allows them to mitigate it to a significant extent, meaning that while suffering does occur, it's untrue that it is always a net negative on an individual's life. You can learn from suffering, it can improve your life, it can give you important, valuable experiences, but also just in cases where suffering is unavoidably terrible, at least we have ways of mitigating that. Third reason structurally, though, why there's probably been more joy or will be more joy than sadness is just that human life will probabilistically continue for a long period of time. And the trend is that the quality of human life is going upwards. Poverty has diminished massively just over the past 100 years. People are getting wealthier and wealthier. The amount of human rights that people have access to is going up. More and more people are not suffering from things like starvation or poverty or all of those other kinds of suffering, which means that for the rest of human life that is going to go on and continue, many people are going to have enriched, fulfilling, and extremely positive lives, and their net positive of a life outweighs any existence of net negative lives, because in order to get rid of that suffering and ensure that that suffering never happens, you equally have to ensure that none of that positive life, none of that super valuable and meaningful life occurs in the first place. At the end of all that, it's just clear that life is worth living on whole. The universe being created was in fact a good thing. Okay, the next response to this then is just to consider intuitively what abstract rhetoric would justify in terms of suffering and positive. I want to talk about, like, for example, take people who do experience in a status quo large amounts of suffering. People who live in, for example, sub-Saharan Africa and suffer from issues like starvation and poverty and a lack of good water supply. I ask you, and I want you to answer this honestly, both our opposition and also the judges. Do these people, yes, experience suffering, have net negative lives? The obvious answer intuitively is no. Yes, they experience suffering. Yes, they go through lots of pain. But if you ask them themselves if their life was worth living, I think that all of them would say yes. The reason for that is because things like promoting genocide or getting rid of people or wishing people had never existed in the first place just because they experienced struggle is just totally morally unjustifiable. Even people who have difficult lives and struggle with them still have net positive lives. I think if you actually look at the base premises that this team relies on, they are totally unintuitive and untrue. This means that, firstly, I think even in the case where these lives are sentient, we win this debate by such a ridiculously huge margin. Because if you believe that most lives are net positive, that most lives were worth living, that human beings have some level of value. If you love your mother and your grandmother and your great-grandmother, if you yourself plan on having kids, you should believe that intuitively, life is worth living, life is a positive. There is no harm in creating more of that life, especially when that life has agency. Fourth issue then in this debate, in this section of the debate, is would this be used benevolently? Would we be violating the consent of these individuals? Firstly, no. We explained that these individuals have total agency, which means that we aren't stripping any rights from them. They have total capacity to control their lives, just like we do, to the extent that our lives are worth living and our lives have value. These lives similarly have value, and we're not stripping them of consent. Secondly, in terms of whether they can opt out of this, they do have obvious capacity to opt out of the existence that they're in. Firstly, you just do have the capacity to opt out of life if you believe your life is so terrible, but also you have the capacity to choose not to have kids and not bring future life into the world, which means that you have agency over whether or not the universe that you're in continues. Fourth issue in this clash then is, would this get used benevolently? The first claim they make is that the universe is random, therefore it can't be useful and be used to benefit our world. I think that even random universes are still obviously useful. Even if we can't perfectly control what decisions they make, we can still make observations about the random decisions they do make and apply that to our own universe. We can also make observations about natural occurrences like environmental events and use that to model our universe. Second issue then with this is that maybe we can't do infinite universes, but we can still do many, and those universes would probably be useful. And thirdly, they claim that existing mechanisms exist, but I would point out that those mechanisms are often too slow in that many people are dying of cancer right now. This would enable us to rectify that much quicker, but also in many cases, we just won't be able to solve this. For example, the existence of collective action problems. We can't prove to every individual that things are possible of getting better, therefore no one acts. But if we can prove and show a model of the certain future, therefore we can do that and fix those massive issues. Ask yourself this: do you think genocide is acceptable? Would you wipe out all human life on Earth? I think the obvious answer to this is no. Therefore, the creation of new life is probably moral. Second and much smaller, less important issue in this debate then is what would be the impact on the status quo. First claim they make is that states act far worse. And their claim here is just that when you know that it's your only chance, you act in egalitarian ways. Firstly, this doesn't pass basic logic tests. If you know that it is your only chance, you act in more irrational and desperate ways to ensure your own self-interest. But secondly, we never said that this would give people other chances to live their lives, simply more that it would allow them to model their future. And that would enable them to reduce the amount of risks that occurred and therefore make better actions that would massively improve people's lives. Then they said that people would get jealous of the better lives that other people are living. Well, now we can improve their lives and make their life better. Clear benefit. This is an obvious win for side negative. If you care about human life, creating more of it isn't a bad thing, and we win simply on those grounds.
I'd like to thank the second negative speaker for that speech and call upon the third affirmative speaker.
Yes, much like my teammates, it's, I suppose, very rare for people to be in an Australs final, including myself, so I'll just say a few thanks. First is to Tanyao Kun, who has been nothing short of warm and good inside and outside of debate and teaches me to be kinder to myself and others every day in spite of my imperfections. I'm very grateful to have found someone in the mess of debating like that. The second is to my friends in UPD, who has cheered us on, to my girls in ICA, who I coach, to my friends from ASHS, who are my first teammates, and to everyone else who has extended love. Thank you so much. But most especially to my teammates, Garcia, who has seen me through my shittiest and still is the most supportive partner I could ask for. And of course, to Luigi, who, contrary to what many people know, judged my first debate speech as my first ever high school coach 5 years ago. And in many ways is why I even started debating at all, because I moved schools just to start debating. These are people who saw me grow and who I deeply respect, and I cannot be more grateful to win Australs with them. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I am evidently very grateful to live in a universe with all the people I just shouted out. But the problem is, just because they do exist does not mean that I often question my existence often feel like there is a lot of suffering that I cannot withstand. And that is a struggle with the neg team because they assert that individual lives are meaningful in themselves, but they do not explain that in the multiplication of worlds, you also multiply the amount of genocides you create. You also multiply the amount of pandemics you create. There is an equal likelihood that when you solve cancer, you also create more COVID-19 pandemics that ultimately rob people of their lives. There are two ways that we win at the top of this speech. If it is the case that people are not sentient, then all their harms of killing people, of creating genocide, and erasing the meaning of life do not exist. And therefore, you are left with a question of uncertainty. Are people happier or not? We weigh that out as early as first half. We are uncertain as first neg concedes whether or not people will be happier with additional information or not. And therefore, the more moral thing to do is to not create that question and to just be more risk averse. That is, if people truly are not sentient, then all the harms from the second part of first neg and second neg do not exist. If people are sentient, and this is the second way we win, then all our existential harms exist. That you are subjugating individuals for your own lived experiences, that you are actually making them more susceptible to more pain. Even if they can say that there are some happiness and some meaning that people in the developing world, like people from the Philippines who constantly are suffering, can find meaning for, oftentimes these are things that we do not want to replicate because there's a difference between death and killing them as opposed to non-existence, where it would have stayed at a net neutral, as opposed to you actually making them susceptible to that hurt and making sure and asking them, please, please survive, because you can find meaning even when you're being subjugated by forces that you do not have the capability to control. At this point in the debate, therefore, if you believe they are either sentient or non-sentient, we're already winning. 3 clashes in this debate I will resolve already for AF to win. First, are they actually sentient? Second, is existence suffering? And last, on social benefit. First, are the beings in the alternate universe sentient? I 100% agree with first neg that you don't really know. We preempted this already at first half, where we explained that you ought to prioritize risk aversion, because how we protect individuals is to not provide them something that can be good or bad for them and then let them assess it for themselves. But if we know morally that there's potential harm to them, then it is more moral to probably take them away from that. So if it were uncertain and there's some chance that you indeed are inflicting existence on individuals who are suffering, even if it is 1%, it's already immoral. And this is where I want to flag that the burden that first neg identifies for themselves is wrong. It's not a question of them providing one example. It is them explaining that in a majority of instances, you would likely derive good meaning and find it moral. But second, even if it is just one instance, that one instance itself creates a moral harm to an individual person that we think is already bad at a point where you generate it. The benefit, the social benefit in the best version of next world does not negate the harm that you create to an individual person when you instrumentalize them and subjugate them, which means that as long as we've proven at first affirmative there is a potential harm to it, that already exists. Second, next proof for why they're not sentient is very thin. Broadly, what they say at first neg is there are likely to be predictive models, and therefore they're not likely to actually be real humans because you just use them to speed up and assess the process. I will first observe that there's a tension. If they say at first neg that these people are likely to live their own agencies and have their own lives because of chaos theory, then that likely means that they do have the capability to make their own choices, and therefore should be afforded the right to sentience for all the reasons that they do indeed derive lived experiences, are similar to us in the way that Umbar, Daniel, Michael, etc., and everyone else on the call potentially live in a simulation. These individuals probably should be afforded that extension of that right. But secondly, so what the implication of this response is just to say, if you want them to live their own lives, and they likely are real and likely are sentient. But second, even in the instance where they potentially are non-sentient, it is the guilt that you create from it, right? Because the individual that creates these universes are likely to believe they are real, are likely to empathize with them on a human experience. Because when you peek into their realities, it's a high-fidelity universe, which means that these are people you potentially identify with, potentially understand. And that is why on their side, you're likely to feel very, very terrible about it. And the creation of that moral guilt is something that itself is immoral. But last, we think they're likely to be sentient because these individuals also themselves are able to make choices, and therefore I do think that it is similar to a child being born. I do agree. I think it is quite immoral that individuals are born without their consent, are living in societies that they do not consent into, and this itself is parallel. Does not mean that we are not creating it. Does not mean that we are killing everyone who is alive. What we are saying is, as long as they are indeed sentient and you inflict potential suffering on them that is uncertain, or whatever outcomes are uncertain, then it's still harmful. Even in the instance instance where they are not sentient, we explain that you are still subjugating a lot of these individuals, and therefore it makes you far worse individually, and other individuals who utilize it because these individuals are unable to actually be happy. At the point in the debate, if you believe that the metric is either happiness or morality in terms of sentience, we're already ahead. But secondly, is existence suffering in the assumption that they are indeed non-sentient? Neg relies on the optimistic belief that life itself will always be meaningful, because either you can opt out of life or that you can just live, laugh, love, because most people would rather choose to be alive than to not be dead. Like, firstly, this is an imperfect assessment of individuals. Just because people give birth to children does not know that they oftentimes believe that existence is itself good. There are many different factors for why they give birth. I don't think that's reason for Sakoneg to give. Statistically, the majority of the world and the people who are economically impoverished, especially individuals who are not born in Western liberal democracies, are primarily in the developing world, and therefore the creation of an alternative reality on their side. The majority of the world are not likely to be touched by the lack of impoverishment or the increase of economic support, as second negative explains. So these are things that are structurally not likely to happen because the vast majority of the world are still born in China and India, where imperfect living conditions oftentimes hamper the lower class and therefore ensure that individuals are unable to succeed. What this means is you still generate a net amount of suffering on their side, because even if the top elites from Western liberal democracies can be happy and free and get that level of freedom, the vast majority of the world that you create at the point where it is incredibly similar to reality are still living in abject poverty. But thirdly as well, there is inherent suffering in existence because of inequality. Let's be real. The only reason why I can log onto this Zoom is on the backs of child labor that created my laptop. The only reason we're able to wear the things that we have is because we are oftentimes profiting out of unequal forms of social factors that we explain at Sako Negative, which means that the privilege and happiness only comes at a trade-off of individuals as well suffering. And therefore, even if you derive some meaning and some happiness, that oftentimes always mean that you are deriving happiness from individual suffering within abject poverty in factories in Bangladesh and the Philippines. And that's why the suffering that you create multiplies so much more under their side. Their last case is, well, it is good because we shouldn't kill people. Again, there's a difference between non-existence at all and killing someone later on. We're not advocating for a genocide. What this means is, on their side, if you can opt out of alternatives and just die, these things are still equally symmetric as a problem. But even if there's some good and bad, the weighing here is we give them net zero rather than letting it be uncertain, and that is why risk aversion is far better. Lastly, on social benefit, and I think this is the most assertive from Neg. They say you're able to for sure solve cancer. That weighing is untrue because they do not prove why that's likely. If you are creating live realities that are similar to our current reality, then you're not likely to resolve climate change as well, because individuals who create the alternative realities also have imperfect information. But secondly, it's oftentimes very, very parallel to our own experiences, and that's why you're not able to adapt technology. But second, being richer as a world does not mean people are happier, and therefore, even if you fix social good, that likely means it's unable to make people better. It's already 8:15. I just want to say thank you so much for this tournament. Thank you for allowing an ESL speaker like me to be in a round that I always just watch. I really love the Australs finals, and I think it's an honor to be here. For these reasons,
I'd like to thank the third affirmative speaker for that speech and call upon the third negative speaker.
This affirmative case only works if you believe that the average person on planet Earth exists in such a state of abject misery that they would have been better off if they had never been born at all, that they should have been denied the chance for a home-cooked meal from a parent, or a sunset with a partner, or friends who make them laugh until their sides hurt, or a cold beer and some sport. Because we tell you on the negative bench that even people in the worst material circumstances on Earth can and do still find reasons to smile. They may have communities that care about them, religions which bring them meaning, culture that brings them meaning. So the simple joy of being alive and moving and breathing and being around other people is in and of itself a benefit, because economic empowerment is not a necessary precondition for people to feel happy, for people to feel like they have control over their own lives, for those lives to be inherently valuable. Suffering does not define them, and it should not condemn them to the oblivion that this affirmative team wants to leave them in. I want to note importantly, right at the start, some new material that comes out at third affirmative. The first thing is to suggest, well, we are not actually killing these people. We're just preventing them from existing in the first place. So it's not an active harm. But our case tells you right from the start that them not existing might not be an active harm, but it does deny an enormous benefit, both to the people whose future lives would have existed that you are now cutting off at the knee, as well as real life people who the benefits of whom in terms of medical research, in terms of scientific advancement, this affirmative team would also deny. So clearly, to the extent that you're not killing them, that doesn't make it any less bad. You are still active. There's still an active opportunity cost there. Secondly, the third affirmative really starts pushing this idea of, well, there's a multiplication effect. So when there's more worlds, there's more suffering on aggregate, and that is bad. But that doesn't matter, because how multiplication works. We tell you on net, these worlds are good. So the multiplication effect works in our favor when there is more net happiness than suffering, using this utilitarian framework they set up. With that out of the way, I want to ask 3 questions in this speech. Firstly, is life in this alternate universe sentient or not? Secondly, is life itself good or bad? And finally, the impact on people in the real world. On the first question, I want to note this is our quickest path to victory, because if you have doubts about whether or not the people in these alternate universes are real or whether they're capable of actually enduring suffering, 90% of the affirmative team harms fall out of the debate, and all of our benefits to the currently existing set of people in the real world, in terms of things like medical research, in terms of things like climate and economic policies, are certain. Second affirmative claim fall is uncertainty, but you need to be comparative. One universe gives you far less certainty and far more risk than thousands of universes which you can simulate simultaneously, which you can speed up to see the end results of. So obviously, if there is some uncertainty, that is not comparative in this debate. And we tell you empirically, it is true that this is just a simulation, right? So if you are not convinced either way, which again, there is a great deal of uncertainty in this debate, which both teams agree on, empirically, if they are just pieces of code without real feelings, without the capacity to endure harm, this is a clear negative landslide, because all of our benefits of being able to test things out, of being able to get more information, and that information being able to be used to improve the lives of real people stands in its entirety. But I'm going to assume for the remainder of this debate that they are perhaps sentient, and explain why we still win pretty clearly on side negative. Second question. Is life good or bad? And I want to note that the affirmative team really just has 2 pushes here. The first is a principle that they wisely drop after first because it's silly, which is you can't consent to life. But you can't consent to a lot of things that are on net good for the world and good for you. You can't consent to, for example, going to school as a child when your parents send you there. You can't consent to medical decisions that your parents might make to immunize you via vaccination. That does not mean those are principally bad things that are never moral. That is obviously not how morality or principles work. The fact that you can't consent does not make them bad. Obviously, that is not enough for this affirmative team to prove. But secondly, they tell us that life on a utilitarian level is suffering because lots of people are poor, lots of people are worse off. I would note firstly, I deal with the vast majority of this in my introduction. People can still experience enormous levels of meaning and satisfaction with their lives, even when they are in situations of desperate economic poverty. This affirmative team never explain why that is necessarily a structural block on that. But there are 3 further responses. Firstly, we challenge this characterization just through revealed preferences. Most people are alive even though they could choose not to be alive, and they choose to bring people into the world even though they do not have to, even though there is every possibility that their children could also suffer. That is clearly pretty strong evidence that most people do not feel this way about the world. We ought not deny them the agency to make their own decision by denying them existence in the first place. We tell you also about the hedonic treadmill and the fact that these people do have agency. But secondly, I want to note importantly, utilitarianism is not the only framework of morality that exists in this debate. The affirmative team never justify why it's the only one. If 70% of people have net negative lives, that still does not justify you denying the other 30% a right to life in the first place. It still does not justify you preventing them from ever having come into existence. Obviously, those people still individually have value and meaning that is not offset, because we still care about them as individuals even if on a net utilitarian level, their lives might be bad. But thirdly, not importantly, even if you have some doubt about the characterization in this debate about whether life is suffering or whether life is beautiful, we know importantly, our information that we get from these simulated universes is able to progressively create better universes into the future, because we can do lots of simulations, get lots of data, improve our world, and then use our improvement as the new baseline for future simulations, which means that if you think this debate is purely about your utilitarianism, into the extreme long run, as we're capable of doing more simulations with increasingly progressively better worlds, then at some point, even if currently there is a negative level of utility in these worlds, over time, that becomes a net positive level, and that eventually overtakes and swamps all of the negative teams, all of the affirmative teams' ideas about why the status quo is currently bad. So even if you think for the next 1,000 years, the world will be suffering, for the next infinite years after that, it gets better. If you judge this debate on a purely utilitarian framework, that is a reason to give the debate to side negative. And we tell you here very simply, but very poignantly, life is worth living. Creating more life is good. That is not something that this affirmative team is ever able to prove otherwise. They cannot win the debate. Finally, let's talk about the implications for real people. They want to say, they give us a couple of pushes here. Firstly, they tell us you might feel guilt about creating this universe and causing other people to suffer. But we know that not every single person is involved in the creation of these universes. You can simply opt out if you feel immoral about it. Obviously, there is a self-selection to people who do not feel immoral about it. This guilt is unlikely to eventuate. Secondly, they tell us that people will be envious of these alternate universes and lose themselves with delusions about what life could be for them. But I would note, firstly, a lot of people would probably not react like this. They'd be more likely to react with curiosity and awe, just like in the same way that technological progress that benefits other people in other parts of the world that you can't access doesn't make you resentful. It doesn't make you not think that technology is a good idea. It just makes you think, wow, that would be really cool. Wouldn't it be good if we could use this to improve our situation down the track? That is something that happens all the time. But secondly, people experience envy in parts of their life all the time, things like wealth, height, intelligence. That's not a reason to stop doing something good, right? The Industrial Revolution wasn't a mistake just because other countries would have been jealous of Britain's increased standards of living. That's not a reason not to do something. Thirdly, they tell us that knowing the future is immoral because it exacerbates power imbalances. But the problem with this is it doesn't really exacerbate it because those power imbalances are already there. There's already a difference in agency and capacity under the status quo for a lot of people, which means that information is what is able to level that playing field. Information is what is able to make governments more likely to be able to make those good decisions, to be able to improve the playing field, to improve equality in the long term. Finally, they tell us that, well, we don't actually need to do these simulations because we're already getting progress, but you just need to intuition check this. We are on track to vastly exceed the Paris Accord's limit of 2 degrees of warming. We are on track to have millions of real people whose moral worth you can be certain of are going to die or be displaced or lose their ancestral homelands. That is clearly a massive harm. So if you think there is even some value in getting more data that is able to convince more people that climate action is necessary, or do think better medical research, better space exploration, that has the potential to benefit the only group in this debate you can be absolutely certain of. We get lots more data to do that. Life was beautiful. Life had meaning. Only side negative was able to protect those lives and make them worth living in the first place. Vote negative.
I'd like to thank the third negative speaker and call upon the negative reply.
Two questions in this reply. Firstly, is the creation of new sentient life good? And secondly, what is the impact on our world? Is it a good one or a bad one? Very simple debate. Firstly, it's creating new life good. Here we get many rhetorical pushes from Team Affirmative. They firstly list examples of suffering that, yes, are horrendous. Secondly, they explain that there's structural inequality and explain that most people live in the developing world where their lives must be bad. And thirdly, they explain that maybe this universe might be created by bad actors. That first claim we deal with. We say we don't have to support that, but even if we did, it would be unlikely to be true. But more broadly, we deal with these claims, all of these claims from Affirmative, in a much more structured way. That is to say, even if some instances of suffering do occur, and even if they do affect a majority of people, we give you reasons to believe that a majority of people that you will create in this universe are likely to, on net, be benefited from that creation, and on net be thankful. What were those reasons? Firstly, the revealed preference that many people in the world do have to have children. Third Affirmative says that this is immoral as well, but the average reasonable voter would disagree. Secondly, we explain that most people would rather choose for themselves to keep living. Thirdly, we say people have the capacity to self-select into lives that they would prefer. Thirdly, we say we have biologically programmed hedonic treadmills, which means we never get that unhappy despite our material circumstances. That's why some of the poorest people in the world are actually very satisfied. Fifthly, we explain we give these people agency to do what they want. But finally, we explain if it were so bad, we can get rid of those situations, improve the absolute worst cases. The weighing that we get from third affirmatives to say that even if there is just a little bit of harm, that outweighs all the benefits. But that is not how you ought make utilitarian decisions. You ought decide what is most likely to be beneficial for the most number of people. So if it is true that these were real people with real lives and real feelings, then absolutely you should vote with side negative. Absolutely, you should give them the chance to experience those lives that would be meaningful. But if the simulation isn't sentience, then affirmative's burden was to prove that the use of this, what is now a tool, must likely be used in a way that is utility negative. And that is an incredibly difficult burden for affirmative to meet. What are their claims? The first is to talk about jealousy and guilt. We say, firstly, it's unclear, they didn't model whether everyone can even see this universe, whether everyone has access to it. Secondly, we say it's easier to readjust. Once your expectations change, then you can obviously not do that. And thirdly, Sam gives you other reasons why that's not true. Secondly, they say that morally knowing the future is a bad thing. You might be less yourself, that maybe you can't choose what happiness means to you. But what we say firstly is that the material and utility that you would gain from this technology outweighs that. And they give us the weighing here. They explain why people's lives in the developing world are so bad that you might actually need this technology to improve them. So maybe you lose the you gain too much certainty about the future and you have some distant harms to that. But the material difference we can make to issues like climate change will absolutely outweigh that. The final thing they say is that, well, governments have better incentives if this universe doesn't exist. Maybe there are power imbalances. But we say, firstly, it's unclear why that changes in this comparative. This is still the only chance that we have in our universe. It's unclear why there would be a difference here. But secondly, we explain that information actually corrects for imbalances. It allows people to take control of their own destiny. It allows people to stand up to those corporations that might be so evil. But even if you believed every single one of those claims from side affirmative, you simply needed to weigh them against the benefits that we certainly were able to provide on side affirmative, side negative, because it is just true that this tool will, comparatively to the information we have now, cure millions of people from cancer, will help us stop climate change, will uplift millions of people out of poverty much quicker than we would have in the alternative. This tool is useful, but more than that, it's highly possible that it gives the opportunity for millions more people to have a life that is worth living.
I'd like to thank the negative reply for that speech, and to conclude the debate, I'd like to welcome the affirmative reply.
Okay, all right, hello everyone. Luigi, Day. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, and go. In a word, our case was very simple. These universes are very sad, life is very sad, and thinking about universes makes life more sad, or changing our world to make some people happy makes life more sad. Two things in this speech. Number one, how did we deal with AI sentience, or what I would call robot lives matter? And number two, how did we deal with how this affects individuals, or what I would call zombies or humans too? Firstly, on robots. 1O started this hullabaloo by saying that we will never know if these individuals are sentient beings. And our response was to say that the precautionary principle must dominate. Their response was to say that, oh no, it's just likely computer code on a screen and they likely don't experience pain. And so this is only about gathering information, like what they said from 3.0. Our response is very simple, and this is why we dominate this. The visceral process of creating this universe is highly advanced, and thus mimicking humans in every single way they think they have personality essentially is akin to being a human being worthy of moral consideration. And the fact that people would likely fail to distinguish this from the real world, or the fact that they would assign such meaning to particular universes in ways if they are using it as one way to relive an experience from the real world, already means that they are worthy of moral consideration due to being models of people we have also assigned moral worth to. So either this is internally produced moral worth or externally assigned moral worth, and thus in either scenario it is most likely that the process of creating these universes creates sentient beings that are of moral worth. But the more important question that negative hinged their case on is on 2.0 is whether a universe necessarily creates more unhappiness or not. And their reasons for why most lives are net negative are insufficient. They said people decided to have kids. Well, two things can be immoral. You can definitely create more kids into an immoral world, but also make more immoral universes. Poverty is diminishing and people's lives are improving. Well, poverty is not a metric alone to determine happiness, which the 3.0 said as well in their speech. So these are insufficient responses because they fail to account for how many people or how people may manipulate these other universes for their own personal ambition and happiness. So you change the courses of history within these alternative universes in ways like the experimentation mechanism of 1.0 that leads to instrumentalization, which we argue is immoral, but it also likely on a utilitarian perspective causes more real concrete harm for the different individuals in these universes. But two, we also said that these lives may get richer and quality may improve, but happiness can still decline for a vast majority of individuals. And this is certain that most parts of human history which involved human suffering will need to occur over and over again in the creation of these universes. The last effort from 3.0 was to say to acknowledge that the limitation of the responses are true, that economic empowerment is not enough for happiness alone, but that people can find meaning in the world that they live in, that people can find meaning in smiles if they are poor. This is limited by the other universes that exist and limited by the ways in which you can change their universe in substantially pro-inequality ways. So we said in terms of capacity, in terms of how their lives are actually lived, those universes become more worse in the process of being able to create more and more of them or finding the best one that suits particular individuals, especially if those that are utilizing this for their own self-interest do it for their own interest alone at the expense of others in that process. How do we then deal with affecting individuals and zombies? 2.0's response was to say at 7:56 that we don't pass the vibe check of logic and rich people might act irrationally. The point of the argument is that not people will act rationally, but it's that more universes create more certainty that the rich will always cement their power in forceful and unequal disproportionate ways. So a self-preserving defensive incentive for the rich in the world that we live in is better than an incentive to gain more power and control over the world that we live in right now, because they have more capacity to play the lottery game with these simulations. But more than this, the best response was to say at 3.0 that individuals are constrained to unhappiness in our world, and so they can have more information to level the playing field. But we stated that if we cannot rely on the certainty of happiness, then our perception of our agency and control over our world is more important. And I agree in 3.0 in this aspect. And thus, a world where people cannot predict the future and control it for themselves is one where more people have the freedom and leeway to determine happiness on their own terms outside of simulation-based metrics that are assigned to them by other individuals. So information is distributed in ways that cause more unhappiness for the poor on their world, but in our world, we are able to at least find worth in the smiles and cups and coffees and the opposite for ours. For these reasons, I am very, very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Affirmative reply for that speech and thank all of you for an excellent debate. On behalf of the whole panel, I'd like to once again congratulate you all for what was a really excellent debate and proof of why both teams made it to this stage, and look forward to seeing you all at the announcement of results.